Hey guys, welcome back to Sockets and Sideburns. So today we're finally doing the timing belt and the water pump on the Renault Clio. Now this Clio is a Clio 2 from 2005 with the 1.2 16 valve D4F 722 engine in it. Now this engine is also fitted to a lot of other vehicles, the Clio 2s, 3s and 4s, the Twingos, 1 and 2s I think, and also the Dacia Sandero and the Logans as well off the top of my head. Now the procedure for the belt change should be relatively similar on all those models, just how you get to the belt may be a little bit different. Also on the Clio 2s, if you have AC fitted, you're going to have a slightly different auxiliary belt setup, as well as the water pump elbow pipe will be different as well with a different seal. As far as timing belt changes go, this one is pretty easy. There's a lot of access around the timing belt area and the process isn't really that complicated. That being said, mistakes can be made, particularly with the tensioning procedure, which I will go over in much more detail later. It seems like at some point the manuals got misinterpreted and it just stuck for some reason. The main thing, as with all timing belt changes really, is to just work carefully and methodically. The biggest hurdle we're going to have on this job, again as is most common with timing belt changes, is getting the crankshaft pulley bolt loose. They are actually quite easy on this engine, and if you have an impact it's going to be even easier. I will be showing lots of different options for undoing it and a fail-safe way to undo the bolt by locking the flywheel, so we can also torque the bolt back down correctly later. Now Renault's interval for changing this belt is 72,000 miles or 5 years, whichever comes sooner. However, they do recommend reducing that mileage to 54,000 miles if the car is used in adverse conditions such as lots of idling, stop-start driving, slow driving, towing, anything like that. This Clio has 114,000 miles on the clock, and this will be its second timing belt change. So that's 30,000 miles early on this particular car, but about 8 to 9 years too late. Now I don't recommend doing that or pushing any of the interval limits. If the timing belt does break when the engine is running, it's going to be a lot more money and a lot more effort to fix it. The best policy with timing belts is earlier rather than later. Now, as I mentioned, I will be changing the water pump as well. I'd always recommend doing this at every belt change, as the water pump is driven by the timing belt. The one on this car is actually the original, as it wasn't changed at the first belt change, and it's leaking and well on its way out at this point. Now, if the pump seizes, it will destroy the belt. At 114k, this pump hasn't actually made the second belt change mileage interval, and it's already been leaking for a while. Yours may not be leaking now, but they don't often last through 2 belt changes, and you will have to take the belt off again, so you might as well do it while you're in here anyway. Now, if you are changing the pump, I highly recommend draining out all the coolant. If you are changing the pump but trying to minimize coolant loss, then leave the resi cap on and don't open any of the bleed screws until you're refilling, but honestly, it won't make much difference at all. Now, when doing this job, there are a few unnecessary things that are in the manuals, main one of which is removing the bonnet, which is not necessary at all on the Clio. That's actually for the Twingo. The other thing is removing the spark plugs to make the engine easier to turn over. Again, completely unnecessary. You can turn over the engine just fine with a 3/8 ratchet. Also, bear in mind the age of these vehicles. Bolts are going to be rusty and plastics are going to have gotten brittle, so please just be gentle with everything to try and avoid and minimize breakages. Now, we will need to lift the front of the vehicle for this job. I like to do as much of the work as I can up top before I lift the vehicle, but you could lift the car at the start of the job if you wanted to. Just make sure to put your handbrake on, chock the rear wheels, and use an axle stand, and don't just leave the weight of the car supported by a jack. And don't forget to crack your wheel bolts a quarter turn before you lift it off the ground. Now, we do have some safety warnings for this job. They're mostly for the coolant that we're going to be using, so obviously if you aren't changing the water pump, you won't need to worry about those. The main one is to make sure that the engine and cooling system are cold before you start working on them. Never remove the coolant resi cap or any of the connections if the coolant is hot, as the system is pressurized when it heats up, so it can come spraying out or boiling over. Another thing to point out is that when the engine is hot during your bleeding procedure at the end, is that the fan may cut in at any point, even if the ignition is switched off. So keep your extremities out of the way, and if you have long hair, make sure you tie that up out the way as well. Coolant itself is also poisonous and smells sweet, so it's attractive to children and animals. Don't leave it lying around anywhere, whether it be new in a bottle or old in a drain pan. Keep old and new in clearly marked bottles, preferably out the reach of children, and certainly don't put any in any old kind of drink bottle. And then make sure your old antifreeze is in a clearly marked bottle and take it to your local recycling centre where they have a bunch of bins that you can put it in and get rid of it properly. Also, coolant is usually a skin and eye irritant, and it strips paintwork effectively sometimes as well. So if you get any on the vehicle paintwork, make sure you rinse it off immediately with water. And in addition to all that, just make sure you check the bottles of any products you're using, any labels, and make sure there are no additional safety warnings. Now also we'll be working around the battery, alternator and starter motor, so make sure you've got any watches or rings removed as well. And lastly, of course guys, as always, gloves and glasses. Right, let's get to it. Right, first things first, pop the bonnet. With all big jobs where I'm going to be draining fluids or spraying penetrants or anything like that, I like to slide a big bit of cardboard under the car just to save the floor and catch anything that might miss the drain pans. Next we'll disconnect the battery as we'll be working near the alternator and potentially the starter. This also stops anyone, including ourselves, accidentally trying to start the car. We're going to be removing the battery negative cable, slacken off this 8mm on the clamp, and then wiggle it off the battery post and just stick it down somewhere out of the way so that it can't flop back and remake contact with the battery negative post. Airbox off now. To do this, we just need to pull off the PCV pipe. If it's stuck, give it a twist near the end and then it should pull off. And then I like to tuck it in this bracket here. Then either a 7mm socket or a flat blade screwdriver to undo this Jubilee clip here, holding the airbox to the throttle body. Then the airbox has got 3 pins on the bottom of it going into rubber mounts, here, here and here. So we just put our hands under it, give it a lift up like that, and then wiggle it off the throttle body. There should be a gasket in here. Sometimes it will stay with the throttle body. It's come off in this case. If it stays on the throttle body, make sure you pull it off, recover it, and refit it into the airbox now, which will make refitting easier later on. And then just pivot the airbox up and over onto the battery. You could leave the airbox resting on the battery for this job, but I will be removing it. To do that, you've got 2 clips here and here holding the air intake pipe onto the airbox. If you just lift those up, and as you're doing that, push the airbox away. Easy to get one started and then the other one, and then just tuck the pipe down into the engine out of the way. Put the airbox on the bench. The alternator drive belt is up next. Now, before I remove this, I'm going to make a mark across the alternator onto the mounting bracket, which is a fixed point. The way to tension these on refitting is with a Hertz reading. I get that using a smartphone app, which I'll show the app and how to tension later. But putting a mark across will help us get roughly in the ballpark for the tension later and save us a little time. Now, although you could use this reference mark for tensioning instead of using the app, I don't recommend it as it relies on the previous belt having had been tensioned correctly. And I'm going to assume that everyone watching has a smartphone or can get access to one to set the tension using the app. And if you do need more information on removing or tensioning this belt than is in this video, I actually made a video just about replacing that belt, which I'll put a link to in the description for and a card up on the screen now. So I'll just run a line across here, across the alternator and onto its bracket. To remove the belt, we need to slacken off the 2 bolts holding the alternator in place, a 10mm on the top here and a 16mm on the bottom. They don't need removing, just slacking off. Start with the bottom bolt first. This bottom bolt is a through bolt, so the threads on the other side are exposed. Give them a look over, and if they're crusty and rusty, give them a good wire brushing and a squirt with some penetrant. Right, we can undo this bottom bolt now, 16mm, and just slacking it off. And now loosen off the top bolt, 10mm. With those bolts slackened, we can now push the alternator forward towards the engine to take the tension off the belt and slip it off the alternator and crankshaft pulley. So just push it forward like that, and then off the alternator pulley and crankshaft pulley. And after that's off, pull the alternator back away from the engine just to help get it out the way when we drain the coolant, which is the next bit. Might need to use a pry bar just to get it all the way back. Okay, next up we're going to be draining the coolant. Obviously there's no need to do this if you aren't going to be changing the water pump. So the best way that I've found to drain the coolant on these is by taking off this pipe to the water pump elbow. This is great because it's this pipe we need to remove anyway. Access to the bottom radiator pipes on these is awful, hence why I do it here. You've got much better access and much less mess on the subframe. Taking off this hose gets about the same amount as pulling the bottom hose off, as it's just the other end of the bottom hose anyway. We need to just watch two things disconnecting it here, however. First is that the pipe is obviously very close to the alternator. This isn't too much of a problem in our case as we have drawn it back quite a bit. Now, as long as you're careful, you don't really get any on the alternator anyway, removing this pipe from here. What you've also got though is the oil level sensor just there under the pipe. This will absolutely get wet as you're going to draw the pipe off over it. So I like to cover it over, and I recommend you do that too. The other thing is on the pipe in the middle here, you've got a clip which is pretty fragile and easy to break while you're trying to tuck the hose down past the alternator bracket. So you can either just be very careful of it or remove it, as I will be. Now, if you want more information on any of this, then again, I do have a separate video for changing the coolant where I go over all of this process in far more detail if you need it. Link in the description and a card up on the screen now. So I'll just cover the oil level sensor with a little cling film to protect it. Just get it over it as best you can. And let's remove this clip. Open it up first. You just pull on this tab here. You can do it with your fingers, but you might find it easier to grab the tab with needle nose pliers, especially if it hasn't been done for a long time. It might be a bit stiff. You just lift it up and out, and then open it up, and we can lift the pipe up and out. And then with the pipe away now, if you turn the clip onto its side like that, it makes it much easier to see the barbs which are at the back here that you need to compress in. You can either squeeze them in with pliers and then try and pull it through the hole, or sometimes when it's at this angle, if you give it very carefully a wiggle and a jiggle in a bit of an angle, sometimes it will pass through the hole without actually needing to have those barbs compressed in. I don't think we're going to get that lucky today. So if we push it back through, let the pipe rest up against it, squeeze those ears together, And as you can see, that is not working. So option 2 is come in against the barb with a flat blade, and we'll have to just depress that barb. As we pull the clip through. Certainly not the easiest thing to do, but it's better than breaking it off. So what was happening is one barb passes through the hole, no problem, but then the other barb is catching up on it. So you just grab the screwdriver, if you can't get on it with needle noses like I couldn't just then, and then give it a little push in. Before we start draining, most manuals will tell you to remove the resi cap. I just leave it on just to slow the flow until the hose and drain pan are nicely lined up. Then we remove the cap and more coolant will come pouring out. Right, slide a drain pan under the drain area. The capacity on these systems is 5 litres, but taking the pipe off here, from previous experience, you'll drain out about 3.5. So make sure your drain pan can hold that. So the clamps used on these Clios are constant tension spring clamps. All we need to do is compress the ears of the clamp together. There's a huge amount of access in here. Just about any pliers will work, pipe grips, things like that. I usually use right angle long nose pliers for this. So we'll just squeeze these ears together, being careful not to slip off as we do so. And take it up past the stub on the elbow of the water pump over to here. Now, if the pipe hasn't been removed in a long time, it might be stuck to the stub. Give it a twist right where it joins the stub there, just to break that seal. If you can't do it by hand, get a set of pipe grips and maybe a rag to protect the pipe if the jaws of your pipe grips are aggressive, but mine aren't. Set them nice and wide, so you're just grabbing the pipe and not the stub itself, not clamping the stub, and then just give it a few twists like that, so you see it moving, and then you'll be able to pull it off by hand. Now we can pull the pipe off and take it straight down past the alternator bracket into the pan and tuck it down there so it's nice and low. Tuck it right down there, under the alternator bracket. Right, with that pipe nicely lined up in the pan, we can take off the coolant reservoir cap, and more will start flowing out. Put that up on the scuttle or somewhere safe. And then we've also got, that we're going to open up now, on the Clio, 2 bleed screws, one here on the upper heater matrix hose and another one down here on the thermostat. We'll open those up now. This bleed screw on the heater matrix hose can be undone by hand, but it's usually quite stiff. Much better to get yourself a beefy, well-fitting flat blade and undo it with that. So if we undo it half, 1, 1.5, 2 turns. And the one on the thermostat should just come off by hand. If it is tight, just go real gentle with a set of pipe grips on it, try not to crush it. And we can take that all the way off, put it somewhere safe, or you could just put it back on there loosely if you prefer. I'm going to take it all the way off. Now I'm going to remove the starter motor. I'm doing this for locking the flywheel later to get the crank pulley bolt out. Now there are lots of different methods of locking the crank, which I will go over when I come to remove the bolt. But I'm actually going to be doing it this way using a flywheel locking tool. So I'm removing the starter now before I jack the car up. But depending on which method you choose to use, you may not need to remove the starter, obviously. So to remove the starter, we just have 2 electrical connections on the starter motor solenoid here. and then 2 bolts, one here on the starter going through into the gearbox, and the other one up on the gearbox side, just there under that wiring loom, going through into the starter. Electrical connections first. We've got this 13mm nut holding the starter motor supply cable on. So we'll crack that loose. Spin the nut off by hand. And then slide the connector off the stud. And then we have the solenoid trigger wire, which is an 8mm nut. Crack that loose as well. And then spin this one off by hand too. This one is captive. It's all crimped together, so the nut just stays on the connector once you've got the nut off there. It all just stays together just like that. And tuck that up out the way as well. Now we can take off the mounting bolts. Do the lower one on the starter first. Both of these bolts are 13mm. Crack that loose. And then the one on the gearbox as well. Just get ready with your other hand to catch the starter as you take it out, but it shouldn't go anywhere as it's on a dowel. And with those two out, we'll give this a wiggle and ease it out. Okay, last things to do up top now. We've just got some clips, some pipes and some cables to remove. They're either attached to things we need to take off or they're just going to get in our way. First up, and not strictly necessary, is the fuel vapor pipe here. It's just going to be in the way. It's over the top of the engine mount and the whole timing belt area. We're going to be constantly reaching down here, so it's best just to remove it now. To do that, come over to the inlet manifold, and there's a button on the underside of this connector here. You can't see it, but I will show you just now. And you just push that in with your fingernail, give it a wiggle back and forward a few times, and it comes off the stub there. And then it's clipped onto a bracket on the inlet manifold. Take that out, and then what you can do, come round and you can just hook it up on the bonnet like that. There is also a cable tie here holding the wiring to the charcoal canister onto the engine mount, which we need to remove. You may find yours is held on by a proper clip or a cable tie, it varies. So we just need to cut this tie. Be careful not to cut the wiring. Lastly, at the back of the upper engine timing cover, we have a clip holding on the fuel supply pipe and a section of the engine wiring harness. Best way to remove this clip is grab it on the end first, because when this releases, it's going to spring, usually straight down the back of the engine. Then get yourself a small flat blade and come in where there's a nice gap. Get it started and then twist out 90 degrees so that you get yourself pulled away like that, and then just unhook this end and it will click out, and then you've got it. And then we can just pop out the fuel supply pipe, put it round the back like that, and the same with the wiring loom here, just put it round the back. Okay, I've done all the work I can before lifting her up, so let's lift her up now. We need to remove the driver's side wheel now. If you have original Renault alloys like this one here, then you'll have this fancy hubcap in the middle. You need this little key to get them off. If you've lost this key, you can use long nose, needle nose pliers to get this off. And then take out the 4 19mm wheel bolts. Stubby didn't cut it today. Get Big Red instead. Piece of cake. Right, now we have to take the wheel arch liner out in order to get to the crankshaft pulley and the lower section of the timing belt area. This is held in by screws and a bunch of trim clips on these. Now these screws can be quite easy to break. My recommendation is to use a screwdriver and tease them out, so run them in a bit, run them out a bit until they free up. If you use a key, you're just increasing the chance of breaking them. And with the plastic trim clips, what you want to use is a proper trim tool. This will massively decrease your chance of breaking them. If you do break any screws or clips, I'll try and leave some links for more in the description. Now, there are actually some different variations of wheel arch liner fitted to the Clio 2s. No matter which one you have, the clips and screws are going to be in the same place, but if you are lucky, you'll have one where this front section here, breaking about there, is one piece on its own. So the whole wheel arch liner is going to be 2 pieces, in which case you'll only need to remove the screws and clips holding this section on here, and then you can just pull it off rather than the whole thing, or folding it back like I'll show you in a minute. So I believe there should be 3 screws and 6 clips holding these liners in. So starting from the front under the bumper, you've got a clip there, and then a screw in the corner there, T20. And then working our way up from underneath to the front, we've got one more T20 here, and another clip here, another one here, and then moving up and over to the back side, we've got one more clip there, one down at the bottom, and one on the inside here. And also there should be one more T20 here. As you can see, this one's broken. This is the one that tends to get really difficult to remove, especially if you've got a lovely little crack in your wheel arch liner like we do here, that just lets mud and water pour over the back of it there. So start with this one under the bumper first, and just in and out for a sec. There's that one. And then get this clip out. You might have to, sometimes you can tease your trim tool right the way in. Sometimes you need a screwdriver just to lift the edge of it up, and then just tease it out. This one's probably a more difficult one because it goes into something that flexes as well. Got an idea for that. One of my new tools that I picked up from America. These are good for this kind of thing because it should just, if it can get it in there, there we go, and it should just push it out. There we go. So that trim clip there might prove to be the most difficult just because it all flexes up away from you. Screw number 2 on the wing here. In and out. If memory serves right, these ones are just going into plastic, whereas I think the one at the back might be tapping into metal, hence why it's so easy to break, but that's out. Clips 2 and 3. Okay, so with those 3 clips and 2 screws out, if you had the 2-piece liner, I believe this is where the front section would just come away at this point. However, with the 1-piece liner even, we can still fold it back and tuck it behind the strut tower if we like. So if we pull it away from the link here to the wishbone, and then if you just ease it out from behind the wing around. There we go. And there's a bit here that needs a real good tuck in and away. Let's come away there. And then if we swing it out and up, we can tuck it up here and away. So with that, like that, just tucked up behind the brake disc there, this is the view we've got of the crankshaft pulley. You can't really improve your visuals by taking any more of the liner off. So I recommend you just do this, fold it back up to here, and you'll have good visuals on the crankshaft pulley. And if you want to look up from underneath at any of the timing components, if you do want to take the whole thing off, you've still got this clip on the bottom here, potentially this screw to tangle with, and this clip here, and then one more just there to take out, and then just keep on popping it around the wing and pull it all out. But I recommend you just go to there and that'll do you. Right, now we need to remove the crankshaft pulley bolt. These are nowhere near as tight as they can be on some engines. There are quite a few methods that you can use to remove this. Method 1 is to use an impact wrench. It won't need to be a super heavy hitter, but a cheap 200Nm one probably won't cut it either. Doing it this way, you won't actually have to lock the crankshaft, and it is quick. This is the way that most garages will do it. You will, however, still need to use one of the methods of locking the crank later, so that you can tighten the crank pulley bolt, which needs both a torque and angle tighten. Maybe some places might just hammer it back on with an impact gun, but it's not the right way. We should be torquing it down properly. Now, method 2 is going to be to get an assistant to stick it in 5th gear and push the brake pedal as hard as they can. If you're going to try this, then make sure you have both front wheels jacked off the ground. Based on personal experience, this doesn't often work. The disc just slips through the pads, and obviously it requires a second person. Method 3 is to lock the flywheel, thus locking the crank, using a flat blade screwdriver in the flywheel ring gear. This is actually the way that Renault says to lock the crank. You won't need to remove the starter to do this, as there is actually room below it. The screwdriver doesn't always stay in well, so maybe a second person might be required to hold it steady, and of course there is the risk of breaking something. Method 4, and this is the most common method I see people using, is locking the flywheel using the timing pin. This is designed for setting and locking the engine at top dead center while we remove and change the timing belt, which we will be using it for later, but the pin is not the proper flywheel locking tool, which is the next method I'll be showing you. These pins are meant for holding the crank when removing and refitting the belt, not to have the bolt undone against it. There are plenty of horror stories of the pin getting stuck or being bent or even breaking off in there, but equally plenty of people get away with it. In my opinion, in this case, it just isn't worth the risk. If you're going to insist on doing it that way, then use a high tensile bolt as your pin, much higher shear strength. And finally, method 5 is locking the flywheel using a proper flywheel locking tool. This is the way that I'm going to be doing this. No risks, and you don't need a helper or any faffing about repositioning things. You do have to remove the starter, but as you already saw, that really is just a 5-minute job. So this tool simply slides into the teeth on the flywheel, just like that. However, be aware that not every one of these flywheel locking tools slides in quite so nicely. You see that one's gotten stuck in there, another one that I have. I'll leave a link in the description for the one which actually fits. Okay, so the way we fit this, first thing we want to do is get it lined up with the bolt hole. So you want to go above on the teeth on the flywheel, so that it's above where the starter motor bolt hole is, like that. you might be lucky enough that you're actually bang on, but here that tooth we're above, and if we go on this tooth, we're below. So of course we must go on the tooth above, because as I mentioned at the start, we have to rotate the engine in the running direction, which in this case is clockwise. So the flywheel is going to come down this way. We can't be rotating it backwards. So we'll just bring this around and get this lined up with that starter motor bolt hole. So just grab yourself a ratchet and an 18mm socket, get on the crankshaft pulley bolt, and real easy, and straight past it. So take it out and set it up again. And that actually looks pretty central on the tooth above. And then just check, run the starter motor bolt hole in. Just check that's going in free and not rubbing on it. Perfect. So now remove this. Now also, if you noticed, it wasn't touching flat against the casing here. So I've just packed this out with some washers on both sides there, just so that it's dead on and not at an angle. So fit this back in. And run it down snug. And give it a pinch up. Okay, now we can remove the crankshaft pulley bolt. So this is completely locked now, and we could undo it with a breaker bar or whatever we wanted. I'm going to try my Milwaukee stubby first though. Obviously I didn't need to lock the crank to use this, but I wanted to show those of you who don't have an impact alternatives. For comparison, anyone wanting to use an impact, this one hits at about a bit more than 300 Nm. And this bolt is an 18mm. Make sure you properly on it. Good engagement. Yes. And she got it no problem. Wouldn't undo the wheel bolts though, would you? That just goes to show you how this is not as tight as it can be on some other cars, because those wheel bolts really weren't tight. And just remove your pulley bolt rest of the way by hand. And as you can see, the crankshaft pulley itself has come off easy peasy. Just be ready to catch the crankshaft pulley. And you can see that the pulley is keyed onto the crankshaft sprocket. Make sure to remember that for refitting, and just recover your pulley, your bolt and your washer. And now don't forget to remove the flywheel locking tool. Now we need to remove the engine mount here, as it's holding onto the top timing belt cover. Before we do that, we need to support the engine so that it doesn't just fall down, which we will be doing under the sump here. So use a trolley jack or something similar with either a big rubber pad or a block of wood, just to spread the load on the sump. And then we're going to come under it and just go to the right of the sump plug there. You don't want to actually be supporting it on the sump plug. And we just want to jack it up just a smidge. You can watch the top engine mount, the rubber, and you should see it just raise slightly on that rubber, and then you know you've got the weight of the engine. A really important thing to take note of here though is if your jack seals are going bad, it will slowly drop under load. So make sure you keep checking the engine and that it's properly supported and it's not dropping down. Right, back up top now. These holes that the bolts to the body go through are bigger than the bolts themselves. So I like to put a few marks around the mount here and here just to help me get it back in the same place. It's not really necessary. Plenty of people don't do it. Crack these 5 bolts loose now, 3 to the engine and 2 to the body. They're all 16mm. And we'll speed these out now. Just watch as you take these out that the engine, it will move a little. Just watch it don't go nowhere. And with those all out, just lift the engine bracket off, take the bolts with it. Now we have the timing belt covers to remove. There are 3 on this engine. Access is restricted to show bolt locations, so through the magic of editing, I'll show you them all removed for reference, with the top of the picture being the top of the engine. I will do my best to show the bolts though. So we've got 3, as I said, top, middle, which is here, covering the water pump area, and then the lower one is just above the crank sprocket there. Firstly, this upper timing cover is held on by 4 13mm bolts. You got 2 down on the left side here, 1 in this kind of recess there, and then there's also 1 down on the front just here. Now the access into this recessed one is an absolute pig. Deep sockets, shallow sockets, doesn't matter what you use, you usually can't get in there. The socket you would need would be a semi-deep, so you could pick a set of those up, or what you could do is you get one of those adapters that goes on the end of a socket and it allows you to use a spanner in here instead. What I'm going to do is we're going to jack the engine up just until this recess comes past where the engine mount goes onto here, so we can get an extension and a deep socket past it. If you're going to jack the engine up, obviously you need to watch out for pipes, cables and things that you're not straining them or pushing the engine into anything. The 2 main things to watch out for while doing this will be the brake vacuum pipe here, and then watch the brake fluid reservoir as well, that you're not closing that gap there and driving anything into it. We're just going to worry about this side of the engine because it will tilt up at an angle like that, so the other side should be okay. You could just disconnect the brake vacuum pipe if you like. It's just 2 prongs that you push in and it pulls off like that. Just remember to refit it later. But in my experience, if you jack up just enough, this should be fine. It'll easily, if I disconnect it here, you can see just how high up that will go without straining it. And keep an eye on the fuel pipe and the wiring loom through here, and do not push up into the brake fluid reservoir. So we'll just start jacking the engine up. Just keeping an eye on everything like I said. And what we'll do is literally as soon as we can get, just like that, a deep socket, that's what I'm using, a deep socket and a short extension, and as soon as we can get on there, that's how far we need to go. So I'll start by removing that troublesome one in that recess. I'll fetch that bolt out with a magnetic pickup, and the two down on the left now. Just make sure you don't back yourself into a corner up against the body there when you're taking these out. And the other one down the side here. And then finally, this one at the front down here. Can actually get on this one with the Milwaukee. And then as you're spinning that last one out, just hold on to the lifting eye on the top of the cover there so it can't go anywhere. And then you can just lift this out and away. One of our fuel pipe had just found its way back into the bracket there, so just make sure if you're yanking on it, just make sure one of the fuel pipe or the wiring loom didn't get back into the bracket. Middle timing cover next, covering the water pump. You've got one 10mm bolt here to take out and another 10mm bolt. If we just head down, you can see it's in that recess there. You may find it's much easier to get at this one from the underneath, especially that bolt over there. This one over here is probably a little easier to access from up top. And before I go for that middle timing cover, I'm just going to drop the engine down a smidge, just so there's not quite as much load on everything, any strain, and just to improve the access below a little bit. But also we don't want to drop it down so far that we ruin the access up the top to see around the camshaft. Get these two 10mm out, start with the one at the back, since it's the hardest to get to. And drop it on the floor, and then get this front one. Let's try not to drop that one. And then we can just pull this cover off as well. And lastly, the bottom timing cover, and the bolt is just in that recess there in the center, one 10mm bolt. And take that cover off. Okay, now we can set the engine to TDC, also called setting the timing. So we have a mark on the crank sprocket here, a dot, and also a little mark on the tooth there, and they need to line up with this line on the casing here. And on the cam sprocket, you've got this little arrow right here, on the tooth, and that needs to line up with the arrow at the 12 o'clock position on the rocker cover, which is right there. If we pull the fuel supply pipe off, you can see that better. That arrow needs to be lined up with that mark on the tooth there, or rather that mark needs to come round and be lined up with that arrow. We also have a hole in the engine casing and on the flywheel that once you have your timing marks lined up, will line up so that you can lock the crank with a pin or bolt. And it's a really good idea just to mark these up with either a paint pen, some Tipp-Ex or something like that, just so that they stand out a little bit clearer. So I will just put a white mark on that tooth there, and this line on the oil pump casing, and the same again on the camshaft sprocket and the arrow as well. Now just note that the crankshaft needs to rotate twice for one rotation of the camshaft. So we can have the crankshaft all lined up at the bottom there, but the camshaft will be 180 degrees out, so the marking's going to be down at the 6 o'clock position. So just do one more turn on the crankshaft and that mark on the camshaft will come up to 12 o'clock in line with the arrow. Now we refit the crankshaft bolt with the washer. And start turning the crankshaft clockwise, so righty-tighty. You must only rotate the engine clockwise, and you're looking out for those two markers as you turn to line up with the fixed markers. So you see the crankshaft one has gone past that marker, and that's of course because the camshaft one is at 6 o'clock there. So it'll keep heading around. And here we go, getting close. And as we bring that top mark close, come down to the crankshaft sprocket, because it's much easier to see where you are with this one, and you just want to stop about half a tooth before the marker, because as you've been doing this, the hole in the flywheel will have been coming round to line up with the hole in that casing. So down here by where the starter is, or was in this case, there's a hole here on the casing, and you can see there's a hole on the flywheel as well. This is where you're going to put your timing pin. Now in my experience, the timing pins actually don't fit well. Here's one Renault one, and if we try and fit it in, we'll need to give it a good push or a hammer in to get it in. Now the reason for this, as you can see just how rusty the flywheel is, and it's the same in this hole. So if you like, you can run some emery cloth or a bottle type wire brush through here just to get rid of that rust, and then your pin should fit in. Or what you can do instead is take a 7.5mm or an 8mm drill bit if it'll fit in, and put that in there instead. Or what I like to do is I put an M8 bolt in there. So bring our bolt, take it through the hole in the casing, and then if we take it up to the flywheel, we can see here it hasn't actually gone in, and that's because it is very difficult to see whether those marks are just bang on lined up. We're probably just a quarter of a tooth out. So if we go back to the crank and just give it a little bit more of a turn. So reaching down left hand, and then right hand, nice bit of pressure on that bolt, and very slowly come around. And there we are, we're through. That's the crankshaft lock now. Just bear in mind that that's only locking the crankshaft, not the camshaft. So just be careful when you're working from now not to rotate the camshaft if you can. And just give the marks on your cam and on your crank a final check. Everything is in line. Right, now that everything is locked and all of our marks are lined up, we can take the tension off the timing belt. Loosen off this 13mm nut on the tensioner. And then put a 6mm Allen key in the hole on the hub here. And we're going to turn it clockwise to release the tension. Wait for the tensioner to head back away from the timing belt. There we go. And we'll remove the nut off the tensioner all the way. And then we should be able to just pull the tensioner off. If you can't get it to come off, just push your belt forward a little bit and you should be able to slide it past it. It's much easier to remove the timing belt with the tensioner out of the way than trying to slide it past it, especially if they've been on there for a long time. And now with the tensioner out of the way, we can slide the belt off the sprockets and pulleys. Just be careful, especially around the camshaft sprocket, because remember, it's not locked. If your belt is kind of old, you might need to give it a bit of a wiggle, persuasion to get it off there. Take it off those two. And out from around the crankshaft sprocket. Right, the water pump can come off now if you're changing it. It's held on by 7 10mm bolts around the edge. It's not going to be easy to show you where they are, so when I've got the water pump removed, I'll put a video up on the screen now of where all the bolt locations are. Just slide your drain pan back under the car if you pulled it out, because there might be a little bit more coolant comes out when we take this off. I'll start with the ones at the back first, as they are a lot easier to get to, and I'll leave that one at the front by the pipe elbow till last, because that'll be easy to get to. Crack all these first. And then we can start just getting them out by hand. One. Of course, that went straight in the drain pan, which we're supposed to be putting there to keep the place tidy. So we dropped our socket straight in it. That's what you get for doing the right thing. Number 2. Three. 4. And number 5. And lastly, we've got 6 and 7's just hidden up here. we do these two at the front. Just means we're here ready. And I always like to take the easiest bolts to remove out last. That's number 6. And number 7. You could hold on to it ready, but if it's been on here a long time, this one's the original, I highly doubt it's going to go anywhere on you. Unlike that bolt, which very nearly went. Okay, so this water pump is now just on 2 dowels on the cylinder block. Can try and give it a wiggle off, but as I said, it's been on here a long time, highly doubt it's going to let go. You can pry it or hammer it off. There's a good spot here, this ear here, to give it a hammer. Just be careful of the plastic elbow here. Some pumps use sealant to seal these on, some pumps use a gasket. If you've got the one that has sealant on, it's probably going to be a lot harder to get the pump to come off compared to the one with the gasket. And then if we just bigger hammer. Here we go. And we've got some coolant coming. And you might just want to give it a tap back on so that it will loosen off that back end as well, because obviously there's no way to attack the back of this. So if we just off and on a few times, hopefully it will break the bond at the back. Try and give it a few wiggles. Here we go, it's coming now. If I can get this original one off, you should definitely be able to get off one that was replaced at the first interval. He says it's coming. It'll be that rear dowel holding us up. Here we go. There we are. Bit of patience, be gentle with it. And as we can see, that pump, see all that residue, the last coolant colour, I know it's green now, but the last coolant colour in here was red. It's all coming from up under the pulley, so it's coming from the weep hole there. So the seals have failed, and eventually it's going to destroy that bearing. And if we, don't know if you'll pick that up on the mic, if we spin it fast, that bearing does sound, doesn't feel bad at all, but it does sound a little rough, and there is a little play in that. And occasionally, if I spin it fast enough, I hear like a slight mechanical metal clanking sound. And I think it's the impeller might just be catching the casing there. If the bearings have got a bit loose, I don't know. Every so often I hear like a dink, dink, dink. Not sure, but definitely we've got play in the bearing, and it does sound rough if you can get it to go like that. But it doesn't feel rough, perhaps a bit loose. With the water pump off now, we need to remove all traces of old gasket, whether that be an actual gasket or sealant. If you had sealant here, then you're going to have more work to do. You'll need to be using a scraper. Just make sure not to mark the sealing surfaces at all, so best to use a plastic scraper, which I'll also do for my first pass here. Then I'm just going to use some Scotch pad and get this whole sealing surface back to shiny. get the big lumps off with the plastic scraper. And then some Scotch pad. The better job you do, the better the pump gasket can seal. Make sure to get around the lugs as well, dowels. And then with that all nice and shiny like that, I'll just spray a little brake clean onto some shop towel, just to give it a good wipe round with. Actually, a bit of shop rag might be better for this. Perfect. The other thing to have a look at while we're here is the crank sprocket and crank seal. So the timing pin is in, obviously, so the crank can't move. We'll crack the crankshaft pulley bolt back off quick and spin that out. Also, a good reason to do this is, you see where the water pump came off, a lot of coolant has made its way around here as well. All we need to do is pull the crank sprocket off of the crankshaft. Give it a good wiggle because they're not easy to get off. Try and get your thumb under here, around the oil pump casing, and a bit of wiggling and persuading, it'll come off. And then we're just looking around the crankshaft seal here just for any evidence of leaking, which ours hasn't got any at all, and we'll give it a good clean up in here, get rid of all that coolant that's spilled down into here so it can't go on the timing belt. You will have some oily residue and whatnot down in here, but there shouldn't be. That's mostly come down from above somewhere in this case, higher than the seal actually is. If the seal is leaking, should be pretty obvious, and your belt would also be contaminated with oil, and ours shows no evidence of that. And then just give your sprocket a check over for anything obvious, like a massive crack, for instance. And if you see, there is a key on the crank sprocket, and it is at the 12 o'clock position when the timing mark is at the 6. And obviously there is a keyway on the crankshaft itself there to accept that. Right, we'll refit the crankshaft sprocket. Just try and line it up with that key dead on, and then it should just go on very easily. And make sure it's gone all the way back. You hear a nice metal stop, and of course it won't go back any further. And just stick that crankshaft pulley bolt back in. And tighten it down. So over at the bench now, so that we can have a chat about parts before we start fitting them. I will leave links to everything I possibly can in the description. So I bought a timing belt kit to do this job. Now all of the items in these kits can be bought separately, and not every kit actually includes everything you might want. At the bare minimum, you must replace the timing belt and the tensioner pulley. So I've bought the Dacia kit, part number KTBWP3211. Just make sure any parts you buy are good quality named parts. So this kit comes with the tensioner, the water pump, and associated gaskets for that. And of course, the timing belt itself. I should have also said at the start, I have got fresh gloves on. If you're going to handle the timing belt, the new timing belt, make sure your gloves or hands are completely free of oil or any contaminants. Now, what this particular kit does not come with is a new crankshaft pulley bolt. Now, on the Clio 2s with the D4F engine in, there's no mention in any manual of replacing the crank bolt after each use in anything like the Haynes or Renault's own manual. However, from the Clio 3s and onwards, suddenly we are replacing them. Bear in mind that the bolt and the crank it's going into stayed the same, so I'd have to guess they had a few snap on them or something, so I highly recommend you change it as I'm going to. As my kit did not come with a new bolt, I brought one separate. I got it from Renault Parts Direct, linked in the description, and the part number is 8200646 Now, one other thing that it's highly recommended that you change are any auxiliary drive belts. So in my case, that's just the alternator belt. I highly recommend you do this unless, as in my case, your belt has only covered a few thousand miles. If these belts snap, they can make their way under the timing belt covers and destroy the timing belt as well. I've seen it happen on these cars. Obviously, you'll have had the belt off the same time as the timing belt, so it's just easier to replace it at this point. I replaced mine already because it had been skipped, as was the water pump, on the last timing belt change. Now, this particular one is a Dacia, and the part number is 291K3, but all you need to know is that information there, 3PK740. You get any 3PK740 belt and it's going to fit. I will leave links to one again in the description though. Now, as with all new parts, we should give them a check over if we are able to. So the first thing that we will be able to check is the tensioner. So we'll give it a spin, make sure it's free and it isn't noisy or rough, and just give the surface the belt's going to ride on a quick check, make sure there's no cracks or any damage to it either. Now also, where you turn with the 6mm Allen key in order to set the eccentric cam, we'll get to that later. If you just turn it so that the bolt hole, mine's already there, but just turn it so that the bolt hole is lined up with these two lugs on the tensioner. Bring it to just there like that, just so that way it's going to be set back from the timing belt and it'll make it easier for you to fit it. If you set that there, it will have the tensioner at its loosest position. It also means that when you tension it it will miss the cylinder head. It's only going to come down, up and around into the cam belt and drive it into the camshaft sprockets like we want. We'll go over that in a minute when we do the tensioning. And the last thing to note is there is a pin here, and that's basically holding the spring on the tensioner back. Do not pull it out yet. We'll do that when this is fitted on the car and the cam belt's in place. We can check the belt. Not really much we can do here. Just check it for anything obvious, like any splits or cracks, but obviously as brand new, it should not have that. Do not twist it, kink it, turn it sharply or anything like that. Otherwise you could damage the internal structure. Make sure there are no teeth roots that are coming away, but obviously it looks fantastic. And also we can check our gaskets over just for any splits or anything like that, which we do not have. And this one goes on the little plastic elbow for the water pump. And then speaking of the water pump, if we grab that, and if we just check that the gasket actually lines up all nicely with the bolt holes, checking it's the right one, and that's perfect. Now when it comes to checking the water pump, do not spin it to check it yet. We'll get to that in a second. Also, one old part that we need to be checking is the crankshaft pulley itself. You'll see there's a rubber in between the two faces here, and you just want to check that over. Make sure you don't have any large cracks and that the whole thing is still together and all in one piece. Make sure you don't have anything obviously damaged on that. So the only component that we actually need to do any prep work on here is the water pump. Now these pumps can come without gaskets. The ones that won't have a flat sealing surface like this one here does. There'll be some grooves channeled into it, and in which case you'll need to run a 1.3mm bead of silicone on the pump mating surface. I will draw on the old pump where that needs to go, and I'll put it up on the screen now. But if you have a gasket, no sealant, just the gasket itself. Now the pumps that use the sealant do seem to be getting rarer and rarer, and I'm pretty sure that you can replace a sealant type pump with one that has a gasket, as all the D4F cylinder blocks are exactly the same. So the first thing to do on here is going to be to swap over the pipe elbow onto the new one. So we'll crack off these two 10mm on the old water pump. And you probably want to give them perhaps a wire brush up. They are not looking, that bottom one anyway, not looking too, oh, that would have been the top one actually. And then that'll just pry off like that, and goody gumdrops, it's actually left our seal behind in this case on the water pump, so we don't need to worry about that. If it didn't and it left it in here, you can get proper seal pick tools, or you could just use a flat blade screwdriver very carefully, a pocket one, just so you don't damage the mating surface on here. I'm just going to clean these bolts up quick. Okay, they're nicely cleaned up, and we'll give this a good clean up as well. Make sure all of the sealing face, it's only plastic, so should be fine. Just make sure there's nothing on there, and get into the groove as well. And give it a good clean out down in there too. Then we can fit our new seal into here. Make sure it's seated all the way in, properly engaged. And then if we grab the water pump, And just be careful because you could accidentally fit it on the wrong way. Obviously, pulley on the left, elbows facing in towards the engine. And make sure this face is nice, clean and free from anything that would restrict the seal. And get our 10 mils back in and started. So these bolts are 9 NM or just a pinch up with a 3/8. They weren't particularly tight. Okay, now remember I said don't rotate the water pump pulley earlier to test it. Now the reason for that is that dry rotating the water pump can actually damage the seals inside the pump because antifreeze is needed as a lubricant. SNR and Gates both have bulletins on this. Now pretty much everyone doesn't do it this way and gets away with it, but on this channel we like to do things properly if we can. So all we need to do to lubricate the seal is fill the water pump with a little coolant and then give it a few turns in the direction of rotation, the direction it would normally rotate. So in our case, that'll be, if the pump's coming down this way, that'll be anti-clockwise. Now what they show you on the Gates videos and things like that is they will submerge this in a takeaway container or something like that and then give it a few turns. That might be a bit messy and you get the whole pump covered in coolant. I think that a better way, obviously, the coolant is going to feed in through this elbow here, so we can just top it up there. That should then fill this chamber up and then we can give it some rotations. So we'll just put a little 50-50 water and antifreeze mix in there and verify, there we go, that it's coming up past that seal. And then give the pump about 10 rotations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, now let's start getting parts fitted back on the car. So water pump on first. If we get our gasket sitting on the dowels, push down, and then we'll just offer our water pump up. Just be careful as you do so that you don't knock the gasket off the dowels there. Isn't a particularly easy thing to do. And then try and hold it centrally if you can. And if we get a bolt started, in the front there, and for now I'll just snug that one up by hand. Now there is a tightening sequence for these bolts and I'll just slack this one back off in a second once I've got a few more of the others almost down, just by hand. So run in some of these at the back now as well. And get that almost all the way down and then just a back off a tiny bit. You will drop your sockets a few times. Don't sweat it. Happens to everyone. And back off a smidge. That's 3 in now. Get this one in the top here. And now with a few more in, I will just back that top one there off a little bit, just so that when we do the tightening sequence, this clamps down evenly as per the tightening sequence. All right, last 2 now. And this one in the top. Now, as I said, there is a tightening sequence for these, and I'll show you it using the old pump with the bolts in it. But basically, we're starting at the top left here, and then just working our way around in a circle till we come back to this topmost one. So heading round clockwise, starting with this one here, top left, and I'm just firstly just snugging them down with a ratchet till they start to bite. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And they all need tightening down to 9 Nm, again in order. Number 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. And 7. Next up, we can fit the tensioner. So just slide it over its stud. And then if you note, there are 2 prongs on the tensioner, and these need to go either side of the rib on the cylinder head here. So if we get that in. So that they're either side like that, so that it cannot move. It's held into place by those prongs on that rib. And then we'll just run our nut on loosely, have it backed off a bit. Right, now we can fit the timing belt on. There's a couple of things to note on these belts. The first one is the arrows that you can see here. These need to be pointing in the direction of engine rotation, which is clockwise. So the arrows need to be pointing towards the front of the car. The other thing is these 2 white marks, one there and one on the bottom or top. And these marks need to go in line with the timing marks on the crank and on the camshaft. Now, sometimes people struggle to get these marks to line up with the ones on the cam and crank sprockets. You'll have it on there and it'll be one tooth out, or as you try to fit it on, it just won't quite reach, and you'll end up pulling the cam out of alignment to get them right, which obviously isn't right. Now, people think they either have an incorrect belt, or perhaps these belts are made for different cars and it simply doesn't line up on this one. Now, what it actually is that there are 95 teeth on the belt. So on one side of these white marks, you're going to have 47 teeth, and on the other side of the marks, you're going to have 48. The side with one more, so the side with 48, is the side that goes around the water pump end. So if you're really struggling to get your marks to line up, all you need to do is simply, it would be that way round for the arrows to be in line. All you need to do, if you can't get this to line up, is simply flip it over just like that and shift the mark that was at the bottom to the top. Or alternatively, before you start, you can simply count which side's got 48 on. In my case, it's this side has got 48 on. Arrows going clockwise, and it's the mark at the top that the writing isn't anywhere near. That's the one that's going to be going at the top, 48 teeth down the water pump side. So before we fit the timing belt, just make sure that all of your marks are still lined up. So on the cam sprocket, the mark's still lined up with the mark on the rocker cover, and down on the crank sprocket, our mark is all lined up at the bottom. And also just check as well that the locking pin is still located. So I like to start fitting these on the crankshaft pulley first, because the crank, of course, can't move, and we're going to need to keep the belt taut on the water pump side, because all the slack needs to go on the tensioner side so the tensioner can take it up. So get that timing mark on the correct tooth on the sprocket, and then I'll push it in just about halfway like that, and the arrows are going in the direction of rotation, righty-tighty, clockwise. And then if we come up to the top and take it around the water pump pulley like that, and feed it partially onto the camshaft. And then locate the tooth that you want to be over with the timing mark on the cam. Ease round the tensioner. Like that. And then we can start to seat this in. Just work it onto all the sprockets and pulleys a little bit at a time. And all of the slack is on the tensioner side. Make sure you've got the mark lined up with the mark on the camshaft sprocket, which we have here. That one's in there nicely. And the same again on the crankshaft sprocket. And that mark, you can't see it, but I can see under the belt, that mark's on there. And the belt is pushed onto the sprocket nicely. And the same up at the top as well. And onto both the water pump and tensioner pulley as well. Now we need to set the tension on the timing belt. This procedure has really confused some people, and to be fair, the manuals don't really explain it very well. The wording is quite poor. The procedure is two-step, and it's the second step that causes a lot of problems, and a lot of people don't actually even bother with the second step. They set the tension in the first step to what it should be in the second step, and then just leave it like that. So we have an eccentric hub to turn with a 6mm Allen key and a pointer to align at different positions in the timing window. It is pretty difficult to see down here. You may find it easier to see everything down in there using a mirror. So the first thing to do is to pull the pin out the tensioner, which will set a little pre-tension on the belt. Now we take a 6mm Allen key, put it in the hub on the tensioner, and then we're going to turn it anti-clockwise, so lefty-loosey with the Allen key. It's critical that we turn it anti-clockwise. If you turn it clockwise, it will tension up the belt, but it will move up. It will move up and around and touch the cylinder head so that it won't spin freely and the belt will rub on it and break. So turning anti-clockwise, and it will move the tensioner into the belt and push the timing belt up into the camshaft sprocket. Now as we're doing it, you see those two black prongs there pretty much in the center of the screen. The one with the hole in it on the left and the one to the right of that. The space in between those is the timing window. And as we start to continue to go anti-clockwise with the Allen key, you can see that block there moving in. That is the pointer. And where we want to set that is so that it is inside, fully inside the timing window, but only just, so just inside of that right one. Now, as we bring this around, I'm actually going to stop it just about there because we need to nip up the nut on the stud as well. And as we do that, it might bring it in a little bit, which it hasn't quite yet. So we'll just go on a little bit further. That will do. And then as we nip that up with the spanner, just hold it still with the Allen key. And then we need to put a torque on that 24 Nm. And again, if we counter hold that, and just make sure that the tensioner isn't touching the cylinder head, which if you followed this procedure with me, then it shouldn't be. If it is at any point during this procedure, set back to TDC, remove the tensioner and the belt, and repin the tensioner and start from refitting the tensioner all over again. Okay, now we need to rotate the crankshaft over 6 times. As you're doing this, try to watch the tensioner and the water pump pulley as well to make sure they're moving. So we need to remove the timing pin, or bolt in my case. So crankshaft round 6 times, clockwise, so righty-tighty. That's 1. Right, coming up on our last one now. So get ready with your timing pin, like earlier, because it is very easy to miss. Here we go, coming in. Set our pin against the flywheel ready. And as we come around, there we are, in. Okay, now you've spun the crankshaft around 6 times. Make sure that the marks on the camshaft sprocket and rocker cover line back up again. Obviously, we know that the timing pin's in because we just pressed it in as the crankshaft came around. And we'll check on the crankshaft sprocket that the mark is in line with the casing, which it is. And I should also point out that the marks on the belt are not going to line up at this point. It would take a lot more revolutions to get them to line back up again. That's fine. We're just looking for the timing marks to be lined back up. Okay, now stage 2. We need to bring the pointer, which you can see is at the edge of the timing window now. We need to bring that into the center of the timing window. It might not actually be where you set it in stage 1, as it might have moved a little as the belt bedded in. If more tension gets applied to the belt or less, the pointer will move as the tension on the spring in the tensioner decreases or increases, as this tensioner is a dynamic tensioner. So holding in the hub again, and we're going to crack the nut off no more than 1 turn, but we won't need to go anywhere near that. And then if you just keep turning the key anti-clockwise again, and you're just looking to bring that pointer into the center of the timing window, just like that. And then we are going to tighten it up. While holding the eccentric hub. Torque the tensioner down to 24 Nm. You guys are in my way a little bit there, so I'm going to move you. Couldn't get the torque wrench on. Counter holding the hub still. Now that's 24 Nm. That's set perfect. And don't forget to pull your timing pin out. And what I like to do now, just quick, it's not in any of the manuals, so you don't have to do this, is just, I'll give it just another turn over, just to make sure, watching again the tensioner, just to make sure that everything is still, after that final stage 2 tension, that everything is still going around nicely. And I will do 1 rotation of the camshaft sprocket, which would be 2 rotations of the crankshaft sprocket. And we'll just make sure that the mark on the camshaft all still lining up nice. Crankshaft still lines up nice as well. That's perfect. Okay, now that we're all done in the timing belt area and we're happy, we can start putting everything back together, starting with the timing belt covers, working bottom to top, so the lower one first. Just one 10mm bolt for this one. And it obviously needs to go on so that the half moon semicircle part is going over the crankshaft sprocket there, around it. And the torque for this bolt is 10 Nm. Middle cover next, fits over the water pump pulley. 2 bolts on this one, 10mm. We'll just get them started. And the one at the front as well. And again, 10 Nm for these. Lastly, the upper timing cover, 4 13mm bolts for this one, and I'm going to get it started and get one of the front bolts in first. And then we'll try for one of the rears as well. And that other rear one as well. And if you remember, to get the one in this recess in, we're going to have to lift the engine up again. That's why I put these 3 in, just so I can get a gauge of how high I've got to go. So as soon as I can get my 10mm deep and wobble into there, I know that'll be high enough. Bear in mind that that should actually be a bit higher than that. Let's see if that let us have that in there or not. And since all these bolts are going into an aluminium head, I am just backtracking all of them. Waiting for the click to know that I'm not cross-threading them. And we can start getting the others wound all the way in. Okay, that's all of them a little bit nipped up. So torque for these is 33 Nm. Do this nuisance one first. Now we can get the other three. And these two down the back as well. With that top mount back on, we can get the engine mount back on now. We're just going to have to lower down a smidge just to be roughly back in line and level. Okay, we can offer the engine mount up. Just be aware it's got a pin on the mount here that's going into that hole on the upper timing cover. And you might need to do quite a bit of jiggery pokery to get yours in line. As you can see, our engine has drifted quite a bit forwards. If we just get these bolts started by hand a little bit. And the body ones as well. And then if I just let off a little bit, there we go, of the off the jack, just so we can get a little bit closer to where we ought to be. And now, just using those alignment marks that I made earlier, I'm just going to wriggle this into place. That looks to be pretty much spot on with where it was. And the torque for these engine mount bolts is 62 Nm. And with the engine mount back on and torqued, we can lower the jack off the engine and drop it back down. Now we need to refit the crank pulley and the bolt and torque and angle tighten that bolt. So once again, you need to lock the crank using whatever method you selected out of the ones I went over earlier. So for me, that's the flywheel locking tool again. Firstly, of course, we got to remove the old pulley bolt. So new pulley bolt, old washer, and then we'll just slide our crankshaft pulley over the keyway. Make sure that you get it on to the crankshaft sprocket all the way, completely bottom down against it, and then run your new pulley bolt in by hand while keeping the pulley pressed in against the crankshaft sprocket. Okay, stage 1 on the torque here is 40 Nm. Second stage is 70 degrees plus minus 6 degrees, so that's 64 to 76 degrees, but ideally hitting as close to 70 degrees as possible. Now there's a couple of different methods for measuring this. Some digital torque wrenches measure angle. Mine do, but since my 1/2 inch is dead, since the scenic brake job, I can't be sure that I can hit that angle with 3/8 leverage. I'll have to do it a different way. The simplest and cheapest way to do this is to put a mark on the bolt head and then move it 70 degrees. It's obviously not the most precise, especially for angles that aren't, say, 90 degrees or 180 degrees, so a quarter turn and a half turn. I don't recommend you use this as your main method for measuring. However, I do always do this just as a backup method, just in case the other method I'm using fails, say if something slips or if my torque wrench decides to shut off. So most people will put their mark at the very top, but I like to put it the amount of degrees we need out from the top, so I know that when it's at the top, it's done. I just find it easier to go from there to the top rather than from the top to some unspecified angle like that. So on this, if we did it, say, a quarter turn, we're very lucky because our bolt is pretty much dead on flat at the top. So if we did it a quarter turn, that would obviously be 90 degrees if that mark went to the top where that mark is now. If we were halfway between the two, that would be 45 degrees there. So that would be 1/8 of a turn. But halfway between a quarter and 1/8 is 67.5. So just a smidge back from there is where I'll put my mark, just in between the two of those. And if that's dead at the top, that mark there, that'll be 67.5 at least. The other method, and much more precise, is to use an angle gauge. So with this, we just clip our 18mm socket to it. Okay, so now attach it to either a big breaker bar or ratchet, something that can actually get the leverage. And then we need to get the stopper on the gauge to go up against something. I'm also using an extension on here because Renault have put that right in our way. And then if we zero the gauge up again, and we have got to go to 70 degrees, so set it to 0. Keep the head of your ratchet pushed squarely into the bolt. You need to reset that again. Make sure it's on 0 to start with. Keep it pushed squarely into the head of the bolt because it's very easy to slip off this. There we go. And our black mark is actually a little bit past dead at the top. So that's fantastic. And remove the flywheel locking tool or whatever you used to hold the crankshaft still. And we can refit the wheel arch liner now. Fold it back inside the wheel arch and get it started back up inside the wing. This first bit here is the most difficult. There we go. And then the rest of it goes in behind the wing. Reclip it to the link, and then we start getting some of our clips in. We just have 3 to refit, and to refit them, just get them started, and then just push them in. And then the T20. And then underneath as well, hook that up above there, line that hole up for the clip. And the T20. That's done. Wheel back on now. These 4 are 19mm. And then just give them a nip up, give them a proper torque when they're on the ground. Right, that's everything that we needed the car lifted up for done now. So I'm going to lower it back down to the ground and carry on working. You can, as I said, just lower your car down at the very end of the job. Whenever you lower it down, just make sure to torque up your wheel bolts. Torque these wheel bolts up now. 110 Nm for alloys and 90 for steel wheels. $111. And refit your hubcap. Right, working back up top now, get these cables and pipes back on. First, refit the fuel supply pipe back into the bracket on the rocker cover, if you removed it to see the timing arrow there. And then if you did remove the brake vacuum pipe, just clip that back into position now. Then we have the engine wiring going to the map and the fuel supply pipe. They need to go back into the bracket on the back of the upper timing cover. The map wiring needs to go on the one on the right, and the fuel supply pipe going into the one on the left. Then grab the clip, hook it in one end first. The right side is the easiest. Get that end in and then just pull on the left end until it goes over and snap them both into place like that. Put a new cable tie into the engine mount to hold the carbon canister wiring. Then the fuel vapor pipe, just grab it from wherever you stored it earlier, and we're going to clip it back into the bracket on the inlet manifold right here. There are two raised sections on the pipe. They go between it so it can't move left and right. And then over the PCV pipe, and it clips back onto the stub on the inlet manifold. Give it a good push in till you hear a click, and just be careful because there's almost a false position on this where it'll click but it won't actually be engaged. So good firm push, and then give it a tug to make sure it's securely on there. Right, put the starter motor back in. We will locate it on the dowel here first. Fit it in. Just watch the wiring loom above it. Make sure we don't get any of that pinched up. Get it in and just give that a check that all that wiring is free. Nothing pinched between the starter motor and the gearbox casing. Get these two 13mm bolts back in. Do this top one first on the gearbox side. Support the starter motor as you push it in. Just get it started. And then we'll get the bottom one in as well. And then start running this top one in. Don't run it all the way down till you've got the other one snug in as well. And no torque for these that I could find. If you really want to torque, then I think on the Clio 3s, which use the same setup as this, it's 44 Nm, but good and snug with a 3/8 ratchet should be more than sufficient. That bottom one's nipped up now, and do the top one as well. Just snug with a 3/8. Should be plenty. Electrical connections on the solenoid now. Supply cable back on first. Just bring it back forward, locate it over the stud like that, and then push it right the way back. Make sure it goes all the way down. Get the nut back on now. It would be nice to use a ratcheting spanner in here, but there's a plastic stop which stops the actual lug from rotating, and that's going to stop you getting a ratcheting spanner in there. Same on the trigger cable as well. If we get that nut back on. And started. And then a pinch up with a 13mm. Just a pinch. And the trigger wire as well. And this is an 8mm. And again, just a pinch up with a spanner. Next, we can stick our coolant pipe back onto the elbow on the water pump. We'll just grab the cling film off the oil level sensor first, don't need that anymore. Then we'll just grab it up from wherever we stuffed it earlier and slide it back onto the elbow. Give it a bit of a wiggle and it should go on. Make sure it bottoms all the way out down against this stop here, and you should have, ours has worn off a little bit, but there should be a white marker on the pipe there, and that should be in line with that stop there, and make sure it's bottomed up against it. Then we will just compress the clip. Be patient with it because these ones aren't fun to deal with, but you will get there in the end. Compress the clip, bring it over to the witness mark and line everything up nice and release. And give the pipe a good tug just to make sure it's not coming off. And then we need to refit the plastic support clip to the pipe. Just open it up like that and fit it onto the pipe first. Snap it closed, but don't actually clip it all the way down. Then bring it along the pipe to where the bracket for it to push into is. Line it up with the hole and then push it in. And as you push it in, it will probably ratchet closed anyway. And then give it a tug, make sure it's secure. Time to refit the alternator drive belt now. Again, if you need more detail, I have a video just for this that you can watch. Remember, if your belt has any kind of real age or mileage on it, you should be fitting a new one. Before you fit it, just give the alternator pulley a quick spin just to make sure that it's not rough or noisy or anything like that. Give it a wiggle, check for any play, and check the grooves, that there's no bits of old belt or anything like that stuck in there, and that there's no damage to the ribs either. And then we'll give the alternator a push towards the engine. So slip it over the crankshaft pulley first. Make sure you get it engaged in all the grooves, and then bring it onto the alternator pulley. If you've got a brand new belt, this might be a little bit more difficult, but bring it onto the bottom, just feed it round the top like that. And then if we just bring the alternator back, just to put a little tension on the belt for now, and just run your finger around the crankshaft pulley like that. Just make sure the belt's on all the way around the pulley. Same again, obviously it's on the alternator pulley, that's easy to see. Right, so we're going to measure the tension on this belt with a Hertz reading, which I'll be getting using a smartphone app. These have been compared to the proper tools for reading Hertz on belts, and they're usually very close. Get a pry bar or something similar and stick it between the alternator bracket and a nice solid bit on the alternator. And then we're just going to push the alternator back and have a 10mm handy to nip the bolt up. So I'm just going to try and bring the alternator back so that it's roughly in line with the mark I made earlier on, and then give that 10mm a nip up just there to hold it in place. Hopefully that should be close, as this is the same belt as before, but it'll probably be a little bit out. A new one almost certainly won't be in exactly the same place as you marked before, but this mark, however, does make a good visual reference to make it easier to see how much you're moving back and forward, as you might have to do it a few times. Now let's take a little look at the tension. I'm using an app called Easy Tension by Hutchinson. It's available on both the App Store and the Play Store, and it's free. So firstly, make sure the microphone on your phone is clear, and then bring it close to the belt, around 1 to 3 centimeters away, but don't let the phone touch anything else. and then we're going to select frequency meter, and keeping all of the noise to a minimum if we can, we're going to click the measurement button, and we're just going to want to pluck the belt in the center of its longest span, just like a guitar string, so that we can get it to vibrate. Hit measurement. We've got 201. We'll take 3. 199. 200. So we need to go a bit more to get it to 260. And just take up the slack before you loosen off the 10mm. And that's why this reference mark is handy, because you can see if you accidentally slip back. So I'll take it just a bit more. We'll see where that's at. Measure again. Two 255. 253. 253. Just ever so smidge more. Okay, we just need a smidge more than that, and it really will be a smidge. Let's try it there. Two 257. 257. And 257. So with that tension set, we can tighten the 2 alternator bolts now, bottom one, top one. Bottom one first. 50 Nm with this bottom bolt. And the top one, which is 25 Nm. Right, now we can refill the cooling system, or not if you didn't change the water pump. We will have dropped out around 3.5 litres, might be a bit more as we also remove the water pump. Again, if you need any more information, then please watch my video on changing the coolant on this engine. Last time I did this, it was difficult to bleed out. I found a much quicker way of getting this system burped out doing my coolant change vid, which we will use now. So start with both bleeders open, matrix 1 open about 2 turns, and the thermostat bleeder completely off. And set a rag under each bleeder, because they will just drip once the system starts to fill up. And the thermostat one as well. And also with the thermostat one, a takeaway type tub is handy to have just under here, wedged between the battery tray and that bleeder, as when the coolant comes out of here, it's basically going to come out as a sideways jet. So the coolant Renault wants you to use for this engine is Renault's own, called Glacial Type D, which was yellow or green, and that has now been replaced by Glacial Type E, which is blue. I will be using Preston coolant today. This coolant says it's compatible with any car, any engine, and more importantly, it says it can be mixed with any type of antifreeze, which is handy, as unless you flush the system out beforehand, it's unlikely you'll know what the last litre or so left in here actually is. This coolant also lasts for 10 years or 300,000 miles. Now, if you look on the bottle of whatever coolant you're using, and it's concentrated like this one and not pre-mixed, it'll tell you the ratio to mix up. This with demineralized water will get the correct antifreeze level for wherever you live. But with this coolant, we get a protection of minus 25 degrees Celsius at a ratio of 1 part antifreeze to 1.5 parts water. That's plenty in the UK, and the original antifreeze only goes down to minus 21 degrees, I believe. So that would mean in this 5 litre system, we would need 2 litres of antifreeze. Depending on what is left in your system at this point, that will affect the ratio. I know in my system what is left is very fresh antifreeze and at the correct concentration as well. So I'll be just adding my coolant and demineralized water already mixed at the 1 to 1.5 ratio. Right, stick a funnel in the resi and then start filling the resi up. Just keep an eye on your bleeders all throughout this process and be ready to close them off. We're going to fill slow and steady, starting with 1 litre first. And we're going to go right up to the top of the reservoir. 2nd litre, get ready. And just take that right the way up to the top of the reservoir. Right, and this is the key with bleeding this out quickly, is keep it above that return hose there. This return hose, so that when we burp the system, when we start squeezing the hoses and burp the system, the air is going to come out here, but it's not going to be able to get sucked back in. You can close it off with your finger, so no air gets drawn back here, which is basically just what happens when you try to burp. The air will just pull straight back in here. But if we have the water level constantly above it, then it's going to stop it from doing that. Now I'm going to use a spill-free funnel in order to keep this level nice and high above this hose. You don't have to use one, of course. You would just have to keep topping it up to make sure it stayed above there all the time. This is just easier for me. And there you go, see, that started coming out the bleeder now as a continuous jet. So this way, if you go and watch my other video on doing this way, keeping it above that return hose is so much quicker because there was a huge amount of burping involved in order to get it to do that. Just keep this bottle filled right up to the top until you start to see the coolant emerging from the bleeders. And now we're just going to keep our eye on the heater matrix hose. Wait for it to start coming out of there. We'll remove our takeaway tub while we wait for that and give this area a good wipe down. Have your chunky flat blade ready and we'll just keep topping. And I might just give the bottom hose, this is the best hose to burp from, down here in the center. And if we watch that top hose on the return on the coolant resi, you can see it's actually coming out the top there. But it would usually, you'd see air bubbles. If you had your level here, you'd see air bubbles pouring out of here. Because I've got the no spill funnel, it's coming out the top of the funnel. But if you did it there, you'll see bubbles coming out of there as it lets the level down. Give it another couple of burps. Let that air out. You can see the air coming from the hose there. So I'm going to remove my spill-free funnel now and I'll just top it up normally. So I'll switch back to a normal funnel now and you can really see what I'm talking about now. If we go just above that hose, like so, and then we give the bottom hose a squeeze, you can see that air is coming out, but air cannot be reintroduced until we get back down to the level again. and that aids in the burping of the system. Slack off the matrix bleeder, just another half a turn, and now I'm going to have to do some good pumping on this bottom hose. Keep an eye on that matrix bleeder. As we can see, it's not going to go yet. That should be all the coolant roughly that we need. I've now put in 3.5 litres into the system, so I won't add any more. So that hopefully I then don't have to pipette any out at the end. Here we go. I can hear a good amount of air hissing from that bleed screw on the heater matrix hose. Here we go. You can see that we got drip, 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 drip. So we just tighten that down. 1, 2, and a half. That's that. Just give the screw a wipe down. And retrieve your rag. And with the bleeders closed off, I'll just burp this bottom hose a few more times. I can still hear air. Hold and squeeze. You can still hear some air making its way out. Just in the hope that I can get that level down near to the max mark so I don't have to pipette any out now. That's close enough for me. So just leave your funnel in there and cap off for now. Airbox next. Grab the air intake hose from wherever we stuffed it down, and it just clips back into the airbox like that, and then pivot the airbox back over towards the engine. Make sure the seal for the throttle body's there. Give it a wiggle on. Line up the pegs on the engine with the mounts, and slide your PCV hose back on, tuck it into the bracket. 7mm or a flat blade on the Jubilee. Just make sure that it goes over the hole on the Jubilee clip, goes over the tab on the engine. Tighten that back down. Very last thing to reconnect, battery negative cable. Get it back on the post, and it's an 8mm to do it back up. And give it a good pull to make sure it's secure. You will also need to re-input your radio code again. I have an excellent video for that, which I'll put a card up on the screen and a link in the description for. If you don't know the code, then watch the video before you disconnect the battery, as it's much easier to get the code from an unlocked radio rather than an already locked one. Now we need to start up the car and run the car up to temp to bleed the cooling system. Right, with everything done, we can give the car a start. Say a prayer, cross your fingers, or just trust in your work. We will also now be doing the final part of bleeding the cooling system by running the engine up to temp. So what we'll do is start her up and then set fast idle, so around 1200, 1500 RPM for 5 minutes. Keep an eye on the coolant resi and top it up if it starts dropping. We will also keep an eye out for leaks around the pipe we took off, the bleeders on the thermostat and on the heater matrix hose, and on the new water pump. The water pump might weep a little for the first 5 minutes or so. That's totally normal as the seal's bed in, and it should stop. Then refit the resi cap and set 2,500 RPM until the fan kicks in and back out again. As you're doing this, stay with the car and keep watching the temp gauge. Also, on some cars, you need to set the heater to maximum heat and put the fan on to get coolant to flow through the heater matrix and get any airlocks out. On the Clio, you don't need to do that. The coolant is also always flowing through the heater matrix. There's no valve on it. However, before we shut the engine off, we will run the heat just to check it's working. Just give a final check in the engine bay. Make absolutely sure you haven't left any tools, anything in the engine bay, any rags, any tools, anything like that. Right, start her up. And we'll just have a quick listen for any weird noises. Screeching, whining, anything like that. All sounds pretty good. And we'll set the engine at fast idle, so 1200 to 1500 RPM for 5 minutes. Just have a look for any leaks around the bleeders and the water pump and the pipe we removed. All looks good so far. And keep an eye on that coolant level as well. Ours has gone up a bit, so I might need to take a bit out before I put that cap on. Okay, that's been 5 minutes now. I've just taken a little bit of coolant out of that resi, just because it was above the max line. Now we can refit the cap, and we're gonna run 2,500 RPM until the fan cuts in and out. So just set 2,500. That's 2,500 set, and I'm just going to watch the temperature gauge. I've got the OBD set up, 77 degrees. Thermostat should open soon. I'll check that top hose, and I think the fan cuts in around 100 degrees and should cut out again at about 95, so we'll wait for that. Top hose nice and warm now. The thermostat's open. Everything's sounding and looking pretty good. Right, we're at 95 degrees. Let's see if that fan's about to start cutting in. There we go, it's on. Just wait until it cuts back out again. Shouldn't take too long. And that's it cut off now. Right, taking that down from 2,500 RPM now. We'll just back to idle. We'll just check the interior heat. Comes out nice and warm, which it does. Perfect. And then we can shut her off now. Okay, we can drop the bonnet, and that is the job all done. Okay then guys, just remember to keep checking your coolant level over the next few days, and if it falls out of the min-max markings, just top it up so it's back inside them again, and of course check for coolant leaks over the next few days as well. Now if this video has helped you out at all, then please hit that like button for me. If you'd like to see more videos from the channel in the future, then don't forget to subscribe. You can also find me over on Instagram @SocketsAndSideburns. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.